I'd like to start here, the moment where I actually got to the UK. And rather than actually wanting to study an MA in sonic arts, I decided to study an MA in arts policy and management. The reason for that was because I felt that my career wasn't moving forward due to a lot of issues and grey zones related to how to move in the world of work and employment as an artist. So this research is a bit about that leap, that trajectory, where I decided to look at sound art and work and artwork and work with art and all those various combinations and playing around a bit with that, and then explore how these were being addressed by the communities, how that was being addressed by workers in general, and in specific looking at case studies of feminist experimental music and contemporary music organizations and collectives. And then here I was looking at the trajectory of the Her Noise archive and all the milestones from its being originated in DIY independent communities and the point that it is now, which is a heritage asset of an archive in the London College of Communication. And lastly, I also looked at the artist teacher, the artist facilitator, arts and cultural provisions and in schools and cultural centres, museums, etc., designing and delivering a workshop on hardware hacking and building DIY synthesizers. So the purpose of my research, the dissertation, which my master's ended last year, was to outline the foundations, like elements, opportunities, tensions that arise from looking at artistic work and labor and also practice within this broader sphere of cultural work and the cultural industries. And rather than mostly from the art world perspective, there was also an element of personal experience, which was also ethnography, which, if people are familiar, one possible result, often achieved result of autoethnography is that one actually deconstructs ideas and assumptions of themselves as they go through the process. And in my case, that deconstruction was related to my identity and career being intertwined and completely related with seeing myself as an artist. So that got very disrupted with my experience of migration. And autoethnography looks specifically at trigger and turning points at a person's life. And it's not like biography that looks at an entire life. It looks at a specific point to explore and associate with major social and cultural concepts and investigate that like experience as a culturally meaningful like phenomena. And then lastly, it was why my particular experience was important for no particular reason, because actually, this research was conducted within the framework of postmodernism, where there are multiple experiences of reality, and I offered mine as one possible window into this topic, and which looks at reality as framed and affected by different lenses of race, ethnicity, class, gender, religion. And in my case, I looked at border thinking in specific because it is a form of postmodernism, but it differs from it where border thinking has a particular focus on the elements in the intersectional matrix of power that are located within the historical loop of coloniality and modernity. So, for example, it thinks about particular themes, forms of knowledge, strategies of survival, and subjectivities that are located and engendered in the historical experience of colonialism. This comes after the Mexican-American writer and poet Gloria Anzaldúa and the Argentinian scholar Walter Mignolo. So thinking about cultural work perspective is a sort of a shift from the 1950s, moving from the idea of the art world, of artists, collectors, curators, patrons, connoisseurs, and, aesthetic production, reception, and valuation theories, and it goes towards this idea of that emerged from the sort of convergence of sociology and the organizational sciences open up to media, cultural and education studies, and field network and systems theories as well. And this idea that there's a gigantic industry in comparison with the small niches of the art world, and this gigantic industry is much more regulated, and it's responsible for the administration, exhibition, maintenance, cataloging, advertisement, programming of the arts and culture as a sector. And there's a multiplicity of stakeholders as federal, state, local level, charities, organizations, large institutions, and grassroots, all the stakeholders collaborating and competing and in synchrony and clashing whilst shaping this landscape. In this landscape, there's the notions of work and labor and practice are seen through this perspective. We might think about work as sort of what does an artist occupy themselves with, what forms of work, activities, materials, operations, how do they spend their time, how much does it cost, and all these pragmatic arrangements that have nothing to do with creativity and romantic notions of artistic practice, but just, constantly arranging and trading with various other cultural sector workers. The notion of labor, it could be relevant to this dissertation. It has one strand, which is a unionist and Marxist notion where labor equals employment, and we strive for guaranteeing workers' conditions and rights. When it comes mostly to negotiation, of course, value, time, benefits, welfare, etc. And then the fight for social justice and the exploitation of cheap labor, especially in the lower spectrum of organizations, and specific the ones that deal with high art. And others in the second strand related to feminist and social economics, which does not equal labor with employment, but is concerned with the immaterial forms of labor required to sustain the lives that are actually the base for even being able to have a practice at all. So, and they also raise attention to the various forms of non-financial capital and emotional labor that are necessary to become and remain visible in the scenes. With all the issue, all the this overview that I'm giving you, it raises a lot of issues, which I can't explore in depth here, but I'm gonna just flag one let's think about large arts and cultural organizations which all have in-house creative, technical production, distribution, audience development, admin, HR, and operational departments that work to maintain the ongoing availability of presential but also virtual arts programs, and they also work on another aspect of the organizations to maintain and uphold the public and professional image of these organizations and become, references historically, locally, globally. But puzzling enough, such large and scale and sophisticated division of labor rarely encompass artists who have to compete among an army of unemployed, self-employed creatives to live up to those standards, often as an organization of one, but that actually mimics this superstructure themselves, striving to produce, administer, distribute, and maintain their portfolio work, labor, and practice in this really fast-paced, high-demanding economy, brewed in a particular climate in of the global north economies as well. So I'd like to offer just some excerpts of the various autoethnographic materials that were used in the dissertation, and they were a series of small essays and free writing essays and journal entries over the last 4 years that I've wrote since the first moment I got here, as an outlet for various reflections and impacts of migration. So one main idea that that came from there is that by studying sound arts, the term decolonized being associated mostly with this epistemological and practice related elements of decolonization, and there was a particular period in Brazilian history and politics which Brazil was governed by the workers, our Labour Party, which was from 2003 to 2013, which was also the period after this period that this mapping was made. This is a very comprehensive mapping that was made back then about sound artists and experimental music practitioners in Brazil, and you can see that they're concentrated in this area here, which is the richest and part of Brazil, more industrialized, where the most cultural hubs are. And also one can see here that the different categories of practice that these artists identify themselves with. But what I can tell you to begin with from my own practice is that a lot of times you yourself, you're associated with various categories, and one could be easily associated with all these categories and have a career where they have one work in each of these categories rather than a specific field recording career or something like that. So this was a specific period in Brazil where there's a lot of incentive for digital culture production and various arm's length policies that helped this career developing over the course of those 12 years of policy. So this is where my career was engendered. So so I kept wondering if, to be an interdisciplinary artist that navigates the full spectrum, sort of working with sound as a medium from, punk bands to sound installations to from working with live coding to designing electronic instruments, in working in studio music production, and improvisation, and all of that was not really a disciplinary choice but more an occupational choice. So this was a bit a part of the findings, and I discovered as well that after my experience of migration, this this sort of line of career was disrupted, because migration is not only an issue of changing continents' legal status. It's just a life-changing, massive phenomena, cultural, economic, political phenomenon, and it results in new forms of relating socially and professionally to work, labor, and practice. And even when you have legal citizenship status, or it ceases to be a problem, a barrier, somehow migrants are often faced with lots of workplace pressures, like prejudice, lack of the same sources and narratives that result in accrual of cultural capital and social capital, a general sort of hostile environment, and all while being portrayed by the organizations as tokens of diversity. So in general, I just realized that I felt closer to the discussions that were being held in the unions that were working with migrants and cultural workers than with the discussions that were taking place in the art world. So, and equally, I was having the same experience. Because of coming from a privileged background, I was protected from the more exploitative scenarios of gender violence and violation of labor rights that often affect migrants. But still, I was working more than 2 jobs, multiple jobs, 0 hours contracts, and employed by niche agencies that staff like large-scale museums, libraries, and universities with this precarious employment conditions, but you conduct front of house, visitor services, operations, tech staff, various freelance creative jobs, and then all low paid, while helping these organizations bloom with their diversity policies. So when you cross the burst the bubble, physical bubble of the coloniality, modernity loop in your life, you experience various forms of change in your race, ethnicity, nationality, and class status, and this can come to what is called in migration studies of a constellation of statuses, and where often this shifts in the matrix of power. Instead of accruing privileges, you accrue oppressions within these shifts. And Anzandua also speaks about this notion of ethnicity crossroads, which are sort of non-binary statuses, that if my migration was first due to economical reasons for leaving Brazil, due to the coup and the right wing coming to power, but also related with LGBT intolerance, but thinking about being a queer or non-binary person was actually one of the non-binary aspects that my life was going to move towards. So just to finish, I'd like to read quickly this excerpt. Working in the visitor services of multiple museums and commuting often in the massive London Underground had an adverse impact in my tolerance for appreciating artistic work and narratives, especially sound-based. My eyes could not bear reading the labels, catalogues, and statements of exhibitions over and over to pass the time in vigilating galleries. My ears were so stressed with Victoria Line twice daily that they could not bear the complexity of experimental music. My unchallenged assumption that art was my life's work became a postmodern irony. I was working in museums where living artists were a rarer species than an original Van Gogh. This was my new art world, one without artists, populated only with works of art, archives, collections, and personnel departments.